He told me he was working late again. I remember that night like a movie stuck on repeat. The way the hallway light blinked when I fumbled for the key, the smell of coffee cooling on the kitchen counter, the hollow echo of the apartment because he wasn't home yet. At first, I told myself the usual things: deadlines, overtime, a surprise meeting. I told myself when I always told myself when the world tilted a little and I couldn't quite name the cause. But trust is slippery, and little things pile up until they are more than little. He started coming home late, then later, then with exclamations that didn't match the man I knew. He started laughing at messages I didn't see. He changed his ringtone without saying why. He left residue, receipts for dinners I hadn't been at, perfume on his collar I didn't recognize, a kindness in his voice when he answered the phone that had nothing to do with me. I should have asked. I should have shoved the anxiety aside and said, "What is going on?" But instead, I watched the doubt grow teeth inside me. And when curiosity finally won, I checked his phone. I wish I hadn't, but I also can't imagine my life without the moment I did. There was one message that flipped my world over. Not a paragraph, not a confession, a single notification that, once seen, became a small, bright fossil of a life I thought I had. It was innocuous enough if you didn't know what to look for. A photo, a timestamp, a name I'd never heard. But the image told a story in an instant. Him, smiling at someone else. The kind of smile that used to belong to me. Hands in the wrong place, laughter caught in the frame. A date. A small heart emoji that landed like a nail. When I stared at that tiny screen, something in me went cold and then hot, like someone had turned my blood into glass. I remember the exact way the light hit the wall, like the world was pointing a spotlight at the moment my life split into before and after. I'm not a drama queen. I don't grandstand. I didn't march to him brandishing the phone like evidence in court. I sat on the edge of our bed and let the room tilt, letting the noise of the house go muffled until I could hear only my own breathing. I felt stupid, small. I imagined every possibility that would make this not be what it looked like. Maybe it was a mistake, a joke, a context I didn't see. Hope is a dangerous thing because it is deceptively comfortable. It tells you to wait. But I am not patient in the face of betrayal. Maybe I once was. Years ago, I might have tolerated more slights, pushed down more suspicions because I loved him, and because loving someone often means putting up with the edges. That's the cruel myth we tell ourselves. This time, the doubt became a map. Every evasive answer he gave, every late night, every hurried shower after a phone call, they were coordinates. I started paying attention. I watched his habits like a scientist. I watched how he guarded his wallet, how he left tabs open on the laptop, how he sat a little straighter when he thought I wasn't looking. I collected the small things like evidence: a lipstick stain on a napkin, a calendar event that vanished, a meeting that didn't make sense. I am not proud of the ways I searched: a drawer I'd never opened, a jacket I'd never worn, a key hidden in the plant. But there is a moment when survival disguises itself as wrongdoing, and you do what you must. This story isn't about the discovery itself. You've heard that opening before. A woman finds a betrayal, world collapses. What I want to tell you is what came after, because the aftermath is where character is born and worn and sometimes remade. After the discovery, there was fear, not of him, not at first, but of what would happen if I did nothing. I'm not sentimental about marriage vows. I took mine seriously. But when someone you trusted becomes a stranger in the same house, the most dangerous thing isn't the lie. It's the quiet complacency that lets the lie calcify. I could walk away that night, change the locks, file papers, call a lawyer. I could have left with dignity and been the hero in my own tidy story. But my anger was loud and complicated and, frankly, beautiful in its clarity. I wanted justice that felt like a mirror, not petty, not criminal, but true. I wanted a remedy that would take his smugness away and replace it with the exact thing he gave me, a hollow certainty that he had won. So I planned. When I say planned, I mean I thought like someone whose life had been centered on routine, suddenly forced into strategy. I made lists, not the sort that were legal how-tos, not instructions on harm, only the things a woman could put into motion within the boundaries of rights and law and her own moral compass. I gathered facts, not rumors. I got copies of receipts, matched timestamps, noted patterns. I turned my attention from suspicion to method. You'd be surprised how powerful the truth becomes when it's organized. I didn't need to expose him to the world in a bloodthirsty way. I needed to make sure the world that mattered to him, his job, his friends, the comfortable orbit he'd grown used to, saw the person he was when no one was watching. There's a misconception about revenge. People think it's rash, uncontrolled, messy. For me, it was a slow burn instrument. It was patience turned into a weapon. And patience is far more devastating than a sudden explosion. I waited for the right openings. He had an important promotion on the horizon, a team that respected him, friends who admired his calm competence. Those things are delicate. Reputation, trust, credibility. They hold a man up in the eyes of the world. If you know someone's bones, you knock out the supports. I didn't plan anything illegal. I didn't threaten or blackmail. I collected truths and set them like dominoes. You might ask, what would you have done in my shoes? Be honest. Would you have waited this long for payback? I don't expect you to answer out loud. This is the quiet poll of souls in the dark. But asking that question is part of the story. It's the way guilt and righteousness tango inside a person who's decided to move from victim to author. For me, the waiting was not for malice. It was for the right moment. The moment when his flaws would be most visible and his accountability unavoidable. I started with small ripples. I made private copies of things he thought were ephemeral. An email thread no one would notice, a photo he'd sent from a bar, a canceled meeting. I organized the timeline and cross-checked it with his calendar, his receipts, the places he claimed to be. Coincidences evaporated. Patterns emerged. Then I did something people often forget. I used the law without dramatics. I contacted a lawyer to understand what evidence meant in a legal sense, not because I wanted to blow everything up in a courtroom, but because truth has a form, and the form matters. My lawyer was pragmatic, quiet. He told me the difference between what I felt and what I could prove. He told me the cost of going public and the protections available to me. He reinforced that the cleanest revenge is often the one that doesn't require you to step outside the law. While I built the framework, I also rebuilt myself. You cannot do this work from a place of shame and expect to win. Shame makes you small. Strategy makes you dangerous. I started going to the gym again, not to win him back, but to feel my body as separate from betrayal. I bought new clothes that didn't scream for attention but whispered confidence. I reconnected with friends I had let drift away under the comfortable dull-dust of marriage. It's important to note this. Recovery and revenge are not always opposed. The better you feel, the more devastating your comeback can be, because confidence is the mirror that shows others what you see in yourself.
There were close calls. I will not romanticize them. The weeks I spent orchestrating felt like walking across a frozen lake, and sometimes the ice cracked. Once I nearly sent an email in a moment of adrenaline without double-checking the attachments. I had collected a file that proved a lie he told about a business trip, and for a heartbeat, I wanted to forward it to everyone on his office chain. I stopped. I remembered the lawyer's voice. I cooled my fingers and rewrote the plan. Another night, a friend asked over drinks if I'd begun anything, guilt or curiosity or both, and I almost told them everything. I held my tongue because the plan required silence. Each near mistake was a test of discipline. You cannot pull a life apart and expect the pieces to fall exactly as you wish without being willing to act like a professional. He remained oblivious, or so I thought. He wandered our apartment, humming songs I used to know, kissed my forehead with an intimacy I wanted to accept because it made the pain softer for a second. People are excellent at hiding while they sleep with the truth. He spoke of a promotion with pride, of a client's praise, of teamwork and loyalty. The irony was the thinnest thing between us. He trusted the world because he had paid for it with charm, and I would take that currency and spend it against him. The turning point came at a company dinner, the kind of event where reputations are displayed and polished under soft lighting and polite clapping. I went because I wanted to be in the room where he believed all his good things lived. I sat at the bar, nonchalant, listening to the laughter and the way the air smelled of wine and new leather. I watched him from the corner, watched his gestures, his easy charisma, the way his colleagues hung on his words. He was all light, and the world accepted him as such. That acceptance is currency. I cashed it. I didn't confront him at the table. Instead, I approached someone else, a woman on his team who had been polite but distant at previous events. We had met months ago when I'd run into the elevator. She was sharp, direct, the kind of person who didn't like moral ambiguity. I spoke to her privately, not with accusation, but with facts. I presented timelines. I mentioned meetings he claimed and where he'd actually been. I showed receipts and dates and photos, all arranged with the bluntness of someone who knows how to tell an accounting story. Her face fell into something complicated, the cresting concern of someone who understands the cost of truth. She asked for time to process. I didn't push. The legal framework I had set allowed her to approach HR without being accused of witchcraft. When truth slides into official channels, it's harder to dismiss as petty. Within weeks, the ripple became a wave. HR initiated an inquiry. The company put a temporary hold on his promotion, the kind of administrative freeze that feels like polite betrayal, the worst kind, because it's bureaucratic and cold. He was called in, and I watched him from a distance as he tried to script his defense, using the one language he thought he owned: performance, dedication, results. It was a scene that made my stomach turn in old ways. The spectacle of a man who had thought himself invulnerable, suddenly made accountable by facts rather than feelings. Word spread in the small, cruel way workplace gossip does. Not everyone knew the whole truth, but enough people knew pieces, and in pieces the truth becomes rumor, and rumor corrodes respect. His colleagues who once deferred began to nod less and to look toward the leader the company needed rather than the performer they favored. The promotion slipped away like a book pulled from a high shelf. The committee cited integrity concerns in bland phrases that sounded like nothing and meant everything. He came home the first night after the inquiry with a face I had never seen on him, anger edged with panic. He accused me quietly at first, then loudly when the walls were too thin. He called me a traitor. He called me hysterical. He tried to turn the narrative back on me. That was a moment of human ugliness that made me realize how much he had banked on the protection of his public persona. He had counted on people believing the polished version of him. That arrogance was the soil where my revenge bloomed. Of course, there were consequences that felt bitter in places I hadn't expected. People who saw him as a friend saw him as wounded. Friends chose sides, as they always do, and not everyone chose me. Some accused me of orchestrating drama for attention, some of ruining a man's career. Those words stung, and for a while I felt the pang of collateral damage. Revenge is never tidy. It slinks and nips and leaves marks on people you didn't intend to hurt. I had to live inside that moral blur and remember the inflection point. He had chosen to betray, and my decision was not without its own cost. I decided I could live with that cost because the alternative was living with a lie. The real climax, in my mind, wasn't a courtroom or a viral post. It was a sequence of losses that applied where it mattered: trust, leverage, and comfort. He was asked to step down from a client relationship because of conflict of interest concerns. A key investor decided to reassess his involvement. A friend who once introduced him to opportunities began to withhold endorsement. The slow attrition of his world was vivid and precise, people withdrawing small privileges that had once been his by default. He fumed, he ranted, he made threats that were mostly vapor, because threats without credibility are just noise. In the end, the thing that hurt him most was the realization that the world he had curated with smiles and cleverness was not impermeable. A foundation that rests on performance and charm can be pried apart by evidence and by people who decide to believe the person you were instead of the person you pretended to be. There was one more scene, the one that settled like a weight. He came to me one evening, late, thinner in a different way, not physically, but in his defenses. For a moment, I saw the man that I loved, not the new stranger who had betrayed me, but the one who once left notes on my pillow. He tried to apologize. It was clumsy and brittle, and it came too late. He asked for forgiveness like someone asking for a favor to make the pain stop. I could have given it. I did not. Forgiveness is not a currency to be spent for comfort. He had to face what he had done, not buy it off. I told him to collect his things and go. I told him we would divide what we needed, cleanly, legally, like two people who had once avowed truth to each other, but had chosen different souls. When the last box left the apartment, something unclenched inside me. The air seemed different, not lighter exactly, but more honest. There is a peculiar peace in seeing consequences play out. Revenge, when it is not about cruelty, but about accountability, can look like a quiet settling. The people who mattered to me, friends who had tested my judgment, family who had circled warily, came to my side when they saw the pattern and the facts. They apologized for doubting me in small ways, and I accepted in the ways that healed the most. People often ask me if I felt satisfied, if I had imagined his downfall and rehearsed the smile. The truth is more complicated. There is a satisfaction in the writing of balance, in seeing the world respond to truth. There is also grief, because we once loved someone who turned into someone else, and that grief is real and cannot be replaced by vengeance. The two can coexist: satisfaction for justice achieved and sorrow for the loss of what might have been. I let myself feel both. Sometimes strangers will approach me online and ask if I regret what I did. They paint hypothetical corners with moral absolutes. Was it selfish, vengeful, necessary? I tell them what I tell you now. I do not regret reclaiming myself. I do not regret demanding that truth be treated like the currency it is. I regret the things I did out of pain before I had a plan. I regret the collateral, the friends who left, the tidy illusions that broke, but I do not regret the verse of my life where I refused to be quiet. I learned that dignity is not always the same as silence.
You might wonder whether the man I broke rebuilt himself. People change, some repent, some hunker down in bitterness, some become careful versions of their former selves. I don't spend my nights thinking about his fate. I spend my nights thinking about my children, my work, the things I lost to complacency. I spend them listening to music that makes me feel like I can breathe. I learned to love myself as someone who will not be gaslit into believing her pain is imaginary. I learned to set a boundary that was as firm as any legal document, but softer in its humanity. If you are sitting there and you are thinking, I'd have done the same, maybe you would. If you are thinking, I never could, maybe you wouldn't. This story isn't a how-to or a manifesto. It's a confession and a map of the inner logic of someone who chose to survive with consequence rather than endure with silence. The revenge I gave was not meant to be spectacle. It was meant to restore the integrity that had been quietly stolen. I did not shout. I arranged. I did not break the law.
I documented the truth. And so I walk now in a quieter apartment, the pictures on the wall rearranged to show a life that belongs to me. Sometimes I catch myself checking the phone. Old habits are stubborn, and I shake the reflex off like a bad dream. I meet people with new caution and old curiosity. When someone asks me what I learned, I tell them to honor their instincts, but to temper those instincts with strategy. Be honest with yourself about where you are. Standing at the edge of a cliff of emotion will not make the ground move. Plan, if you must, but do so in a way that will not leave you morally bankrupt. What would you have done in my shoes? Be honest. Would you have waited this long for payback? The answers are different for everyone. Mine came from a place of hurt that expected a future of the same. It became instead the end of his comfort and the beginning of my life. I don't gloat. I remember the small, soft things that made us my us. But I also remember the single message, the tiny heart emoji, and the way it landed like a bullet. I remember how it felt to choose myself after that. If justice can be measured in the restoration of one's sense of truth, then this was mine. If revenge must be a war, then let mine be the quiet reclamation of dignity that he could not take from me without consequence. When I say the next part felt like walking a tightrope, that's not a metaphor I borrowed lightly. After the public unraveling at his company, everything that had been private required new tending. My days filled with meetings with my lawyer, not dramatic confrontations, just a lot of quiet logistics and paperwork. And with conversations that felt like inventory. Who knew what? Who might be called to testify? What records existed? And which impulses I had to starve to keep the plan clean? I learned the language of restraint. Restraint became my armor. I learned to answer questions with the same flatness I saw on legal forms, factual, unemotional, blunt where necessary. It was harder than I expected. Emotions want to explode. They want to make noise so the world will see them. My job was the opposite, to be unremarkable in order to be effective. Because I refused to hurt anyone physically, revenge became craft. It required the kind of boring, detail-oriented work that doesn't photograph well for drama, but wins slowly. I cataloged phone logs and receipts and meetings with the same careful hand I once used to plan vacations. I traced his lies back to their sources. Where had he learned to be so smooth? Who enabled him? Those were the threads I tugged at slowly, not to break people gratuitously, but to reveal how one person's small dishonesty rippled into other people's trust. There are moments when you realize that betrayal is not a single act, but a system, habits, choices, and the social infrastructure that rewards certain kinds of charisma over others. Pull enough threads, and the whole thing begins to reveal its seams. There were people who surprised me. The woman on his team who had been the first to take my facts to HR became an unlikely ally. Not in the way of friendship, but professionally. She wanted the workplace to reflect its values and had no appetite for a cover-up. We had awkward conversations in coffee shops where we both pretended to talk about weather while she quietly described what it was like to be in the room when he lied. Another surprise was his assistant, a young man who loved the prestige more than he loved truth. When I first reached him with a carefully worded note, not accusatory, simply presenting dates and asking if anyone could corroborate, he balked. You would be amazed at how often people want to be on the winning side, even if that side is dishonest. He did provide one small, crucial detail, a time-stamped entry from a shared calendar that contradicted the story my husband had told. It was not the kind of evidence that made headlines, but it was the kind that settled disputes in internal meetings. The assistant's decision to hand that over did not come from heroism. It came from a discomfort he could not reconcile with his own conscience. Close calls kept the plan spicy in a way that made my stomach clenched every time the phone rang. Once, a mutual friend invited us both to a small dinner, and for a second I thought I could spin some lie about being busy. Instead, I went, and I sat across from him pretending unlike an actress on stage. He laughed with old friends, and the man I had loved came through in gestures, reaching to refill my glass, making a joke only I understood. It was almost cinematic, almost enough to make me throw the whole plan away and return to the idea that maybe people can be two different ways at once. But the memory of the heart emoji kept me steady. That night, instead of reacting, I cataloged. I watched his rhythm, the way he checked his watch when a woman at the table mentioned a conference he'd attended, the casual mention of a client dinner that did not exist in any calendar. Old lovers' tricks. I also learned that revenge intersects with grief in wayward ways. I grieved the life we had stitched together. Sunday markets, the way he always folded our laundry, the absurd rituals that are only meaningful because two people make them so. Grief made me soft in places, but it also taught me to build new, small joys deliberately. I began to take morning walks I never had time for, carrying a thermos and letting sunrise be its own small ritual. I started cooking recipes I'd shelved when family dinners got routine. I found a pottery class and learned to be clumsy with clay. The first time my hands made something that was just mine, I cried in the parking lot and felt unashamed. These small acts were not distractions, they were fortifications. When revenge is nonviolent, it depends on the strength of the person carrying it through. You have to sustain yourself. There were the nights when doubt screamed loudest. I would lie awake and imagine alternate paths, different endings, where I was the villain and not the wronged. The internet is good at creating moral fog. Someone would inevitably say something cruel on a forum where they only knew the most salacious part of the story. I learned to ignore that and to keep my world small and real. My sister called more often then, not with advice, but with food. Come over. Don't be alone tonight. My mother sent old letters my father had written, those clumsy scribbles of affection that recentered me to the idea that people are messy and redeemable, and sometimes irredeemable. Family became my tether when the world tried to make me untethered. As the company's review progressed, more evidence came out in mundane administrative ways. An expense report contradicted a timeline. A dismissed meeting invite surfaced on a shared drive. A client feedback email predicted behavior that matched what I knew. These were not fireworks. They were the slow erosion of an account that had been built on a social currency of charm. He tried to fight it with charm, the same weapon he had used for years. He reached out to former friends and to the people who mattered in his career, asking for character references for sympathetic private conversations. Some responded with hesitance, others with confusion, most with silence. People do not like to sign on to a cause if they anticipate costs to themselves. The social world is a negotiation. I used that fact. I never forced anyone. I simply provided truth in places where truth could be confirmed without theatrics.
I want to be clear. I did not revel in his discomfort. There were moments I would see him on the street after he had been demoted from that client project, and my stomach turned with a residue of empathy I did not expect. He had aged in small ways you don't plan for when you're knitting revenge. More lines at the corners of his eyes, the way his words came out clipped. There was one week where he tried to be charming again, texted me in a tone that read like contrition but felt like calculation. "Can we talk?" he wrote. "I think we both need closure." I stared at that text for a long time and typed nothing. Closure is not a meeting you host to make others comfortable. It is a decision you make internally. I had to decide if talking to him would be a reset that normalized his behavior or a step toward crisp finality. I chose the latter. I answered with a single line. "No, I think we have what we need." Then I deleted the thread. Part of the expansion of this revenge story involved the public shape it took. I never wanted his downfall to be humiliation porn. There was no mass leak, no viral post spurred by spite. Instead, accountability arrived via official channels. HR findings posted as neutral conclusions to protect the company, the slow evaporation of a professional reputation. The satisfaction I felt was not private cruelty. It was the recognition that a man who had weaponized trust had been made to be accountable for the consequences. There is a deep ethical satisfaction in seeing truth acknowledged by institutions designed to uphold it. I would rather a system work than a spectacle happen. That is not noble, it is practical. People sometimes accuse me of coldness, of being strategic at the cost of compassion. Maybe they are right. Maybe I needed to be cold to keep the narrative straight. But there's a kind of heat that lives under cold plans, a righteous anger that is made purposeful rather than chaotic. My friends were not all comfortable with the distance I kept. One of them, Mara, accused me in tears of becoming someone I didn't recognize. "Are you doing this for him or for you?" she asked. It was the hardest question. Afterward, I sat on my balcony and tried to separate those threads. Revenge is selfish in part. It is reclaiming your center, but it can also be a defense of truth that others depend upon. In my case, both were true. I was avenging myself and protecting the future reputations of people who might have walked into the same trap. There were small, human victories along the way that tasted like something stronger than I expected. A colleague I'd lost touch with because of the fissures in our marriage came back into my life and apologized for their distance. They had been on the fence and had seen the pattern when they did not expect it. Another friend, someone who had been quietly collecting his own doubts about my husband's character for years, told me that seeing the truth out in the open gave her courage to leave a toxic situation of her own. Those were the sweetest returns, when my refusal to be silent helped someone else create safety for themselves. That is the part of revenge I treasure most, when it ripples out into protection rather than pure retribution.
Inevitably, the media found a way to make a story of it in a small local outlet, and the comments were predictably messy. A mixture of support, vitriol, and performative morality. I read a few and then stopped. The internet is a magnifying glass that makes everything grotesque if you stare long enough. The only media interactions I agreed to were with a journalist who wanted to discuss workplace integrity rather than my marriage. Talking about systemic issues felt safer than trading anecdotes. I spoke about patterns and accountability and the need for better HR mechanisms. In that interview, I felt myself step into a new role, not just a victim or an avenger, but a person who had learned to translate personal pain into public prevention. There was one last close call that nearly undid months of careful work. His lawyer reached out in a tone that sounded generous, suggesting mediation and a clean break. I found myself tempted by the idea of a quick resolution that minimized public exposure. Who doesn't crave an easy exit from months of tension? My lawyer, the pragmatic one who had been with me from the start, advised caution. Mediation can be useful, but only if you're certain you're not giving away evidence for the sake of a tidy end. I took his advice and negotiated terms that prioritized protection, limits on public statements, detailed financial settlements that compensated for the instability he had introduced, and guarantees that he would not use our past together for leverage. It was not dramatic. It was a contract that spelled out consequences. In a way, that final legal touch felt like the last stitch in a dress you'd spent months sewing. It made the whole garment wearable again. When it was over, I did not throw a party or dance on rooftops. I made myself tea, sat with music on low, and read a book in which nothing about my life existed. That quiet felt enormous. Sometimes peace is not loud. It is a small room with a window you can open. I let the air in. The healing that followed did not feel linear. There were days when I mistook a stranger's laugh for his, and I had to sit with the odd grief of being trained into a reflex that belonged to a past relationship. There were times when I questioned my stoicism, thinking perhaps I had been too strategic and not enough human. Yet, even those moments of doubt helped. They kept me honest. I started to date again casually when I felt ready, not as an escape, but as a gentle curiosity about what it meant to share a table with someone without suspicion. Those dinners were awkward and sweet in equal measure. If someone asks me now whether justice felt complete, I answer in a way that surprises people. Justice was never a single moment. It was a reframing of my life. Yes, he lost work and reputation, and the confidence that concealment once gave him. Those things were consequences he caused. But my real victory was internal, a recalibration of how I allowed myself to be treated and how I responded when it happened again. I walked away with more than a vindication. I walked away with a sense of agency that had long been eroded by comfortable compromise. I still ask myself questions out loud sometimes, a habit now, a rhetorical way to test my moral compass. Would you have done the same? Did you need to be so calculated? Would your heart have allowed patience? These questions are not meant to invite condemnation. They are practice. They remind me that the line between righteous action and resentful obsession can be thin, and that constant reflection keeps you honest. If you are listening and there is a small, painful echo in your chest that hears this story like a confession of your own, know this: you have options that do not require you to become someone you despise. You can document, you can seek legal advice, you can build support, and you can choose accountability in ways that do not harm the innocent. You can also decide to leave quietly and find your peace. Both choices require courage. Both are legitimate. My life after him is not a tidy moral victory. It is a complex, textured existence where I make mistakes and pay for them and learn from them. I have boundaries in my relationships now, not as weapons, but as maps. I can tell when someone is being genuinely tender and when they are rehearsed. That clarity is more valuable than any revenge I could have engineered. It is the thing I guard because it cost me to get it back. I do not want to be remembered as the woman who broke him. I want to be the woman who refused to be invisible, who translated betrayal into consequence and grief into new rituals. If that sounds like vengeance to you, then call it that. If it sounds like survival, call it that. Either way, this is the story I have. And if ever you find yourself holding a screen with a message that makes your stomach drop, remember that the world will not always punish the person who wronged you. Sometimes you will have to be the one to insist on truth. Do it with care. Do it with strategy. Do it in a way that keeps your humanity intact.